Hi, eighth graders. I'm here to talk about one of the final steps when it comes to writing or drafting. Truly, you have already traveled the most important parts of the road when it comes to this personal narrative. You have come up with a great idea, you've learned how to zoom in, you've planned out your story in pre writing, and then you've taken that planning on the road and you've done the bulk of your writing when it comes to an engaging and interesting introduction, telling the story with dialogue in detail, and now you're going to have an opportunity to craft your conclusion. It doesn't mean that writing's over because oftentimes we'll end up bumping between writing, revising, and editing before we are ready for publishing. But let's talk about today how we're going to bring our pieces to a conclusion. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to study a really great conclusion that you should probably all be pretty familiar with. Then I'm going to ask you to think about some other conclusions that you've read before that you enjoy. And finally, we're going to take a look at the different types of conclusions that you can reference when you are working on crafting your own. So the conclusion that I want to kind of spend some time looking at is from a book that you most likely read last year called The Outsiders. And truly this story comes to kind of an epic conclusion. So you've had a lot of drama, a lot of crazy things that are happening in the story, and it all ends with Ponyboy. The conclusion of the story reads like this. I sat down and picked up my pen and thought for a minute, remembering a handsome, dark boy with a reckless grin and a hot temper. A tough, tow-headed boy with a cigarette in his mouth and a bitter grin on his hard face. Remembering, and this time it didn't hurt. A quiet, defeated-looking 16-year-old whose hair needed cutting badly and who had black eyes with a frightened expression on them. 1 week had taken all three of them, and I decided I could tell people, beginning with my English teacher. I wondered for a long time how to start that theme, how to start writing about something that was important to me. And I finally began like this. Then I stepped out into the bright sunlight from the darkness of a movie house. I had only two things on my mind, Paul Newman and a ride home. This is a wonderful circular reference back to the very beginning of the story. In fact, this particular conclusion references several things that we saw throughout the story. Sunlight and sunsets, the movie house, the different boys who made an impact on Ponyboy throughout the story. This does a wonderful job of kind of circling back and pulling the whole story together as one tight, interdependent unit. This is a master of his craft that can do something like that with conclusion. I'm going to give you some support so that you feel like you can be kind of a great concluder as well, though it might take us a couple of tries to get through things. So one of the things that you could do as a great support is to look at other conclusions. So often we are paying a lot of attention in stories when they start. We're very concerned about figuring out who is in the story, what is the problem that's happening, what's the setting, who are the other supporting characters. And we get so involved in stories that sometimes the end just happens to us. We don't take the time to sit back and read. So I urge you to go and look at different books that you have around. Read the last page. That's all it takes is to see how it ends. Perhaps you'll find that the conclusion starts a bit sooner than the last page, but just reading a sample of those conclusions might help kind of spark something in you to really write a great conclusion when it comes to your personal narrative. If you need some other examples or some more support on how to create a great conclusion, I have something to share with you. And this will be available for your review as well, but I wanted to talk about it here. So we have some examples of narrative endings, and perhaps when we look through them, you might find one that you think would fit well with your story, and you are welcome to use that. So one of them, the first one, is actually the circular ending. It brings the beginning of the story and the end of the story back together. It fits them around to one another, and that is the example that we read in The Outsiders. Sometimes there is a surprise ending. I warn you to be somewhat careful about this because introducing something surprising or a twist at the very end oftentimes leaves the reader feeling confused about whether or not the story is over. So you can use a surprise ending, but I warn you to use it with some caution. There is a lesson or moral ending, and usually what happens is the lesson that the main character, perhaps you in the story, learns becomes very evident, it's very clear at the end, and your reader walks away with that lesson to apply to their own life. The next one is called warm fuzzy ending, and I think that sort of blends into the one before it as well. So you're going to kind of leave with this heavy emotion. It could be a positive emotion or it could be a negative emotion, depending on how your story plays out. But that is the thing, that is the imprint that you want to leave your reader with, is this feeling. You want to really create it and lay it out on the line for the reader to see and feel so that they walk away with that same feeling. I think another one that kind of blurs with some of those sometimes is that reflection ending. So oftentimes, if you are reflecting back to the lesson or the moral that you learn. But a reflection ending usually has the narrator come back and make kind of an explicit judgment about what happened in that story. And so it can lend itself towards having some emotion in it, and it can lend itself towards having a moral or a lesson ending. The great thing is, if you are using one of these three that we just talked about, I don't need you to label what it is, but I need you to work on the effect that it creates. So if you're not sure, is this a reflection ending or is this a lesson ending? Maybe it's a little bit of both. And that's better than saying the end. So we never want to just kind of leave the story, and we never want to use the words the end. That's a very elementary way of ending things. But instead, you want to give your reader something to walk away from. And that's why I caution, and I'm kind of going to take this one off the table, is the cliffhanger ending. It exists. It is definitely very interesting, especially if you are selling a TV series to be produced and you want to keep making money for years to come. So if you end with a cliffhanger ending, you're going to want your reader coming back for more. But in this instance, the personal narrative needs to end. So make sure that you're kind of avoiding this one. The other one that I'm going to say is not effective in 8th grade, though it exists as an ending, is the question ending. Oftentimes I will have students ask, have you ever felt like this? And their answer is, if as a reader I say no, you've lost me. You might have had me up until the very end. Then you did this thing, you asked this question that was like, oh, okay. And I probably won't walk away remembering much from your story after all the work that you did. I do think that there's a time and a place for a question ending. I feel like it's very overdone in writing, and it's kind of an elementary way of doing things. Usually the question is just, have you ever? And it's one that we need to kind of get away from and force ourselves to try something different. So I would say cliffhanger endings and question endings cannot be used for this particular narrative. They exist as types of endings, but they're not going to be great here. And if you want to use a surprise ending, use it with caution. The last two are great. If you can choose to do either one of these, you are ending on a very high note. So an image ending, which what we read in The Outsiders is kind of an image ending. You picture Ponyboy sitting and writing the story of his friends. It also ties back as a circle, but it kind of creates this image in the reader's brain that they take with them. It's something lasting, and it's a very high note to end your story on. The other is dialogue. If you end with a piece of dialogue, it feels so authentic. It lets the reader feel like they were in that story and they were hearing that final word of things. So I think that those last two are my personal favorites, but don't let that influence you. You have creative liberty to try any of the other narrative endings, again, avoiding both the question ending and the cliffhanger. Oh, and I did sort of skip over the funny thought and humor. I think that goes along with the fuzzy warm emotions. So if you sort of want to end with a joke and a laugh, I'm all game for that, but just make sure that it fits and that you aren't sort of just putting in something that doesn't match with the rest of the story simply to get a quick laugh. So if you have questions about this, I urge you to try one, write it out, see how it feels. Does it fit? Are there some revisions? Who can I talk to about getting revisions? Perhaps a peer or your teacher. Hi. And then you can kind of experiment with some others and see if they would work better in their place. This will be available for you to review online. I'll give you a quick note in Teams about where you can find it. And that will conclude your narrative. The rest of the work we will do before it is ready to be published will fall in the editing and publishing category. And there'll be some videos that follow up about that. In the meantime, please enjoy concluding your essay. I look forward to reading the end.